So welcome everybody. This is Elaine. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to share this conversation with you. Joining us today is Jamie Lee Mock, a craniosacral therapist and holistic nutritionist. Jamie facilitates intuitive and therapeutic healing known as SomatoEmotional Release, which connects the physical body to the emotional and energetic bodies. Jamie lives in the west coast of Vancouver Island, where she facilitates retreats and trainings. And she is joining us today to talk about trauma and the embodiment of our emotional experiences. Let's dive into this conversation. Jamie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and sharing what I feel to be such an important conversation, always, but especially now. So I appreciate it, and appreciation to all of you who are showing up today as well. Thank you.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much. For the listeners today, can you share a little bit about what inspired you on this unique journey? Let's go back in time. Tell us, how did you get here?
Yeah, great question. I often think back to this, to be honest, and it's really nonlinear. I remember thinking about this recently, and while I was in the process, really didn't make sense. The trajectory seemed a little bit nonsensical. So going back about 10 years now, it really did start when I began school for holistic nutrition. And that was one of those things where it opened my eyes to a way of being that I hadn't been before. And when I began living by the principles that I had learned, it was like I was opened up to this whole new world. And that was just one specific world. It's the world of holistic nutrition and food and how to nourish our bodies, and a component of mind, body, spirit. And I talk about this often because I started my schooling in Toronto and finished in Vancouver. And when I had made the transition to finish off in Vancouver, the first class of nutrition school that I went back to was with a brand new group, and we did an exercise called dyad, which is a very simple, in theory, simple communication practice where you're able to speak anything that arises, usually with a prompt, and receive full presence from the person listening who is listening. And it's incredibly beautiful, and it changed everything for me. I not only began realizing that there's so much more to myself than I even knew, but that there's a whole world that I didn't know about in the world of vulnerability and communication and being honest with ourselves and being seen. It just exploded. And so from there, I just was fascinated. And I do feel like it is maybe a unique personality trait, but when I am interested in something, I go deep and I'm curious and I ask questions. And so it began this snowball effect. And I'll say that after nutrition school, it led me to create an organic kombucha company, which felt totally random. As I mentioned before, kind of nonsensical path, not that I was even paying attention at the time. And interestingly enough, one day I was doing a delivery for this kombucha to a retailer, and I happened to stumble on a card. I never usually do things like this, but I picked up this card, and I was so invested in healing my gut at the time. And this card was for a medical intuitive. And it turns out that this medical intuitive is now my teacher, my co-facilitator for my retreats and craniosacral trainings. And so the journey began, or I should say, continued to unfold when I met her, and she kind of took me under her wing and for craniosacral therapy specifically. But of course, other things were happening on the periphery just to help me in my growth and really to expand what I knew as truth. So it's been really incredible. And now I've been practicing craniosacral therapy for about 4.5 years and running the retreats. I got into that quite quickly because I did also have a background in marketing. So that's how I was able to help at the beginning. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And now that I'm here, I realize that, of course, it can be nonlinear, but every little thing I've done along the journey has brought me to exactly where I'm at now.
I love that. There's so much about what you just said that I want to unpack a little bit. Because I can honestly relate to you on that as well. I feel like my journey has been everything but linear, and it's like one thing will lead me to the next, and then the next thing will lead me to another. And I find that when I look back at my journey, and when I look back at all the different pieces that kind of came together for myself, when I was like open and aware and attuned to my body as I was making decisions, the journey seemed a lot more fluid and more aligned with like my true sense of self. But in times where I felt like I was maybe going down a certain path and then not really listening to my intuition, I found like it would take me so far away from like that true sense of where I wanted to go or what I wanted to achieve. So one of the things that I want to touch on today, because one of the things that you say, which I love so much, is to heal is to change a pattern. And I would love if you could speak to this in terms of relationships, but also in terms of like a healing from difficult decisions. So for anybody who's ever experienced heartbreak or the loss of a relationship, or even like the loss of a business or a career, I think a major part of healing is all about changing these sort of very deeply ingrained patterns. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I would love to, yes. So, and this is my belief, that's where I'm speaking from throughout this entire conversation. But my belief is that as human beings in this physical experience, we have a foundation that is comprised of patterns that are established at a very young age. And often patterns for us can create a sense of safety and belonging and feeling loved and nurtured, or at least getting what we need. But what I will say is that as we grow and we find our sovereignty and our autonomy, that changes. The patterns change, and they often no longer serve us, or they become outdated, or they're unhealthy when at one point they were healthy. Excuse me. So illness, for example, can be something we look at as a specific pattern. And if we seek to heal this illness in whatever way, we are seeking to change the pattern. So when something is unhealed, let's say, it means there's a pattern there or some kind of unwanted state that we feel that we don't necessarily like. And sometimes it can show up as, a physical symptom in the body. It can show up as, even just an intuitive pang where we feel like something's off, but we can't quite put our finger on it, if that makes sense. And so there is so many ways, a multitude of healing modalities that we can explore to see what these patterns are for us. And I'll give a few examples. So I am a craniosacral therapist, and I do practice a somatic therapy that is connected to craniosacral therapy called SomatoEmotional Release. And this is such a beautiful healing modality that I'll go into a little later, but we could do body work, we could do things like acupuncture, Reiki, energy work, we could go into different, perhaps shamanic journeying, if that's what you're called to do. We could get into herbal medicine. There are so many ways in which we can begin to shift our patterns. And something I heard from one of my favorite women out there today, Kelly Brogan, she's a holistic psychologist.
Yeah, I love her.
Yeah, she is fantastic. And she had mentioned, self-care, and I know that's a buzzword these days, but self-care is a way in which we can shift patterns. And how this is so is because when we are doing things that feel good in our body, for example, nourishing ourselves with organic, locally grown foods, we get that sense of clarity. We get that sense of what's possible, our full potential. And yes, it may not be fully expressed, but we get that sense and we're like, wow, I get it. And you end up wanting, for some of us, to continue down that journey to see what it is that's possible for us in the most healthy, balanced, nourishing way.
Yes, I so agree to that. I think that is so powerful, because I think in our earlier years. So for myself, I know in my teens and my 20s, I like my deep inner knowing, that intuition was so loud that I would get physically sick if I was going down a path that was not right for me. And then what's interesting is that, when I was confronted with decisions like that, and I was feeling these things in my body where my body was saying no, but then I was turning and to other people and anybody and everybody else, and asking them to help me make the decision rather than just trusting my intuition. So I think that, like, I really believe that when, for myself, when I'm making a decision now, I almost wait for that whole body yes. And if it's not, then I now pull back and I'm like, oh, hold on a minute. I'm going to wait this out a little bit and continue to ask more questions and assess, like, if this is the right path for me. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Maybe share some experiences that you've been through?
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to add to that as well, and something that's happening for me more recently, is that I could experience a full-bodied yes, and it might be contradictory to what my mind has actually set out for me. This, like a story or some kind of preconceived, story that my mind thinks is true in whatever way, and I'll check in with my body and it's the opposite. And so that can be a really interesting thing to navigate, because so often we've been taught to listen to our mind, the thoughts in our mind. And something that I find quite frustrating, but what I'm really working towards is bringing this to children, to schools. This is something that is so important, this body wisdom, listening to our innate body wisdom. And I know we'll get into intuition a little later, but I truly believe in what I'll say now is that our intuition resides in our body. When we're able to listen to our body and how it speaks for us, because it might be unique for each and every one of us, that's when we can really tap into our wisdom. And we often, it's not always going to speak what we want to hear. That's the thing. But honoring what that is, and some people might ask, well, why? If it's not what I want, then why would I do it? We've listened to our intuition so that we can experience more ease, more joy, more acceptance, more abundance, all of that in our lives. And we're not constantly pushing against, what our minds think to be true, which can cause a lot of unharmony, disharmony, just disaster a little bit. So, but it's what we know, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I can almost hear right now the listeners maybe thinking to themselves, okay, so I get this feeling. How do I know if it's actually my body or if it's my mind? Or how can I distinguish between those two? What do you think in terms of, making, like, how would you say is the best way to listen to the body as opposed to the mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is such an important question. And I'll say that it may not happen overnight. For myself personally, I've read stories of people realizing later that as children they were super intuitive and very connected to what they call source or universe and angels and things like that. And I was not one of those children. I have zero recollection of being any kind of intuitive whatsoever. And so for me, it was really like a journey of coming home to myself. I had to learn this, and I really wanted to. So the biggest thing, and this comes to embodiment and also intuition, I find if you want to start listening to your body or even deepen your connection to your body and your intuition, is to quiet your outside world. This is, slowing down the busyness, slowing down the technology, slowing down, any disruptions that are outside. If you live in a city, think about how loud it is. There's lights on constantly. These are all disruptions for our nervous system. And it creates this kind of chaotic outside effect. Even if we feel comfortable within it, we might not even recognize that that's happening for us. And yet when we quiet this experience, for example, if you go to somewhere like Tofino, which is why I moved here, somewhere that's quiet, somewhere that has a feeling sense of openness, the body can speak louder. So when the outside is quiet, the body, your intuition can speak louder. And it's not that it's not speaking, and it's showing up symptomatically, it's showing up emotionally, but we're overburdened, and we don't necessarily have what it takes at the time to listen. And so getting quiet and simply observing what the body has to say. And what I mean by what it has to say is it has its own language, and that's going to be unique to you. And also how you digest this information from the body will be unique to you. There are, and for those of you listening, you've probably heard of this before, but the different clairs. And so some people speak to this in intuitive terms, is that you could be clairvoyant, which is a clear seeing. You could be clairsentient, which is a clear feeling. You could be all the things. I think there's about 11 clairs, and it speaks to the senses. Maybe it's a gut feeling. It's an actual physical sensation you get in the body. It's something in your mind that shows up. So it'll be different. And what I've noticed for myself is that over time, it's shown up in many different ways. I've actually been so connected that I'll hear something that I would have sworn actually was a sound happening. And for reference, someone else was there and they didn't hear it. So it's completely unique to the individual. And with the practice of quieting the outside world to go inside is where we begin to develop that. And one more thing I'll add is that trust is so important. Often our intuition shows up as that first initial feeling, thought, emotion. And so often we doubt what that is. And then we override it with thought. The mind comes in, it's like, no, that's silly. Or there's a judgment there, like, oh, that's a stupid thought. Don't, that's whatever. And so it's dismissed. But when we trust, we can really surrender into that first notion that comes up. And I really believe that is our intuition speaking.
Oof, yes, absolutely. For me, I think that that's where I've gotten myself in the most trouble, is because I will be in a situation and I have that intuitive feeling come up, but then I push it down, I push it aside, and then I continue to go down that path until I get so far away from me. And then all of a sudden now I'm presented with this urgency to now change the pattern. So that's where I want to come back to that idea of to heal is to change a pattern. For anybody listening right now who finds themselves in a really challenging situation, a traumatic situation, heartbreak, grief, or loss, what do you suggest are some of the best practices or ways to overcome these patterns or emotions that are so deeply ingrained that we've come so far away from our real, true sort of inner knowing?
Right. Yeah. I think, there's three things that I have in mind as an answer to this question. There are, of course, more, but I'll start with, acknowledging how you are feeling. And so I have a direct experience with this. I went through one of the most challenging, what felt like life-changing heartbreak situations about 2.5 years ago. And at this point, I can reflect on it with clarity. But I remember, and I really do feel gratitude towards myself for how I moved through it, because it was really, really fucking hard. But I just remember, and my mother actually reflected this to me a little bit more recently, but she had said, I had to move back home with mom. She had said, Jane, you were writing every single day. You were feeling your emotion. And she knew this because I would either be sobbing or angry at her or showing up in all these different ways. And she reflected back at me that I was just being with what I was feeling. And this could come in all types of shapes, and it could change over time. It could be anger. You could feel grief. You could feel apathy one day where you feel nothing at all. You could then go into a phase of maybe you feel jealous. And it's just the act of acknowledging that these emotions are present in the body. And if you can give yourself space to just feel them, it's going to be uncomfortable. That's inevitable. But it's like short-term discomfort over long-term disability. I think that's a quote my mom likes to use. And so I really do believe in that. If we can move through that short-term discomfort of everything that's showing up, and mind you, my short-term discomfort was like an entire year. It was terrible. But on the other side of that, I knew that it was for a reason. And so the second thing I'll move into is when you are feeling everything that you're feeling, you can do little things, like we mentioned above, little self-care practices that help change the pattern. Because the thing we don't necessarily want to do is, if we're feeling something, we don't want to get stuck there. Because when we stuck there, that's when a new, perhaps unhealthy pattern can possibly emerge. So we want to do little things to shift our way of being. And that's not to say we would go above and beyond. We do what we can do for, where we're at. But doing those little things, I remember I would take my yoga mat just out to the little kids park across the street, and I would just do yoga under this tree. And some days my yoga looked like me weeping, hugging a tree, and people walking by being like, what's going on over there? But that's all I could do in that moment. And it definitely helped shift. And then the last thing I would say is seeking support. You don't have to do this alone, and you are not alone. So whether that's the support of someone you can really trust to just show up as yourself, if one day you are feeling grief, but you also want to feel some kind of support, well, do you have someone who is there for you, who can just sit with that with you? And if not, that's okay too. But perhaps then you would work with a facilitator. And one thing I love talking about, I just had this discussion and discovery with a friend the other day, is that we all have the opportunity to heal and to do this work. But when you seek the support of, let's say, a practitioner or a facilitator, they are there to help make it easier. And how I discovered this was the word facilitate is derived from a French word, facile, which means easy. So when something is easy and we're facilitating it, that facilitator is there just to make it easier on us to move into that place of healing or unraveling our emotions and what's going on, perhaps even on a deeper level. And so you can seek the support of friends, loved ones, facilitators, practitioners, people you see as mentors, people you trust.
Yes, absolutely. That has been so key in my experience in terms of healing. Let's talk a little bit about the power of breath and how it can support deep healing. Can you also give us an example of an embodiment technique that you find useful?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So something I will mention about breath is that I'm not necessarily a breath expert by any means, but I do understand the power it holds. And usually, generally every session, whether it's cranio or an embodied healing session, I'll begin with the connection to breath. So it's not necessarily that we have to do anything or change how the breath is, but we are noticing, we are witnessing our breath in this moment. Is it shallow and restricted, or does it feel open and, expansive? Where are we at today? We can name it, and that really does give us a snapshot of the entire body system. That being said, I don't often use techniques of breath, but something that's coming to mind is this technique, and it's more of an embodied technique where, I learned this when I was going through psychotherapy with one of my first therapists, and then I saw it come up later on with this course I'm doing with Dr. Peter Levine, and he's a trauma therapist. And so it was very synchronistic, but it's the VU breath. And the sound VU, are you familiar with it?
Yes, I love that.
Oh, it's so good. And I feel like it's a breath technique in a sense, but it's also an embodied technique. It's this sound that is coming from, deep within the body. It can be guttural, and simply all that you do is you inhale deeply and you exhale with the sound of VU. So you'd inhale, VU, until the breath is fully released. And you could go even deeper. I find the more I do it, the louder I get. And you can almost feel that. I can feel it down my spinal column. And it's as though it massages all of the internal organs, but what it's doing is also relaxing the nervous system. And I love that. If you feel activated or anxious or triggered in any way, or you are caught up in an emotion, that's something I really love to do to help bring us back to some kind of balance so that we can continue on forward.
I love that technique. I think it's so powerful because it's got sort of a low vibrational frequency instead of some of the other ones that are kind of very cerebral and sort of an upward energy. So absolutely, I think that's a great technique. Can you tell us a little bit more about craniosacral therapy and maybe explain what it is for the listener who maybe doesn't know what it is?
Sure.
And can you also tell us a little bit about what a session would look like with you?
Yeah, I sure can. So craniosacral therapy, there are many ways to describe this very unique type of body work. So it does, and how I learned it, it starts out as a body work. So you're working practitioner to client, someone is on the table, and it is hands-on. It's very, very gentle pressure. So it's a very gentle healing modality where essentially we are shining a light on the places within the body that perhaps we've dissociated from, perhaps that feel like they're in the dark, that feel unloved, unseen, unheard. And especially within the first sessions, if I'm working with someone over an extended period of time, the first session is just to shine a light. We're not necessarily trying to make big shifts. And that's what I love so much about craniosacral therapy, is that it's gentle so that the nervous system can integrate without being overwhelmed. And so it does include some manual techniques, and you will likely feel different subtle shifts within the body that happen. Some people explain that they have experiences of tingling, or it feels similar to energy work. And yet at the same time, we're working on a physical level with these specific techniques that I'm using with my hands, but also deeper. We're working deeper with the emotional body and the energetic body as well. And all the while, I'm only using about 5 grams of pressure. And I'll explain. So cranio is a word for the cranium. So I'm working from the head down to the sacrum, which is the bottom of the spine. So it was derived from this practice of osteopathy, which is where you're working with the structural component of the body, the bones. And so now cranio has developed from that, and it's more of an attuned listening, where you're tuning into the craniosacral rhythm, which is the cerebral spinal fluid that moves from the base of the spine and up into the head and back down. And that not only nourishes our spinal cord and the nerves and the brain, but then it also flushes any debris, any cellular debris, and anything that doesn't necessarily belong. It flushes it out. And we all have this. It's its own rhythm. It's not the heartbeat. It's not the breath. You turn into its own rhythm. And even within that, just by listening to that, you can tell so much with what's going on for someone's body. It's absolutely incredible. And so because what we know about what we do, how the body holds on to certain trauma, certain emotion, it can live within the fascial network. It's absolutely fascinating. When we work with the body in this way and we work with the fascia so gently, we get to go into things like emotion and past hurt, wounds, trauma, to gently bring them to the surface, shine that light to then have it be released. So it's an incredible modality. And just to answer the second part of your question, as I mentioned, the first session might look simply like body work. And this is also to establish trust between the client and practitioner. That's huge when it comes to this kind of body work. If we're going to go deep, it's imperative that there is trust present. And so as we continue on the journey, I usually give the example that we may only work together 5 times because I don't necessarily want my clients coming back forever. I would like them to get to a point where it feels like a completion, where they feel like they can move on from something that has been burdening them. And so as we continue on the journey, session 2 or 3, we might then begin, as you mentioned earlier, the SomatoEmotional Release process, which is similar to somatic experiencing in that we're going in and exploring the body, the subconscious part of ourselves. We're not necessarily using the mind. We're going into the body and we're creating a dialogue, and we can explore what is going on a deeper level. And sometimes this does take consecutive sessions. So usually I work with clients between 2 and 5 sessions for them to feel like some sense of ease or completion. And it's incredibly beautiful. And as my practice evolves, I am getting more into the hands-off approach. So I still offer craniosacral and absolutely love it. But SomatoEmotional Release doesn't have to happen in person. I don't have to have my hands on the body for us to go deep within that subconscious part of ourselves to explore what's there to then release.
Thank you so much for today's conversation. What you're doing at this time, especially, I think is so, so important. Thank you again for joining us today.